Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're looking at something that might just completely change how you see reality.
Okay.
Like the whole thing.
Yeah, definitely a big one this time.
Yeah, it's all about this idea of the human condition,
Right.
but not exactly how we normally think of it.
Yeah.
Your sources describe it as this like illusion, a construct that kind of keeps us locked in here in this dimension. And then it gets even like weirder from there.
Oh, yeah. You're definitely in for a ride with this one. It mixes Hawaiian spirituality with some really mystical ideas, saying we're not just physical beings, but also these energy beings.
Okay.
And that we're influenced by things we might not even, be aware of.
Yeah, and the sources even talk about like shadow beings and even psychic vampirism.
Yeah.
That definitely got my attention. Like I had to know more. It made me think, is there actually more to what we experience every day than, what we can see and hear?
That's exactly what we're going to unpack today.
Yeah.
So the source doesn't say that everything is already decided for us, like fate, right?
But it does present this idea of the human condition as like a framework,
Okay.
like a set of rules or limits that we're born with. And that this is what stops us from fully experiencing other dimensions until, well, death.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot. Is it saying we're basically all in a simulation?
Not exactly a simulation in the, the tech sense, but more like we have a limited view of reality. The source even says that only a tiny, tiny fraction of people throughout history have been able to, break free from this limited perception.
Okay, so if this human condition is like a framework, like you said, that limits us, who made it? Like, who or what created it? And is there any way to get out of it?
Those are the million-dollar questions. And the source doesn't give us, a straight answer,
Yeah.
but it does give us some interesting clues. One of those fascinating things it talks about is these shadow beings.
Right.
It says they've existed since, the beginning of time, and they interact with us on an energy level.
Mm-hmm.
I got to say, that name, shadow being, sounds a little creepy. Are these, evil things? Demonic? Should I be worried?
Haha. No, it's not that simple. It's not like good versus evil, black and white. The source says these beings aren't necessarily good or bad.
Okay.
They use something it calls neutral energy.
Neutral energy. What is that? Sounds like something out of Star Wars.
Well, you can't move things with your mind using it. It describes this neutral energy as raw potential that can be used for good things or destructive things. It's like electricity can power your home or give you a bad shock, depending on how it's used.
Okay, I see. I get that. So these shadow beings, they're tapping into this neutral energy, but why? What do they want from us?
That's where it gets harder to say for sure. The source suggests these shadow beings can affect our thoughts, feelings, even what we do.
Really?
And not always in a good way. It even brings up this idea of psychic vampirism.
Psychic vampirism. Is that like when someone drains your energy? I've heard people use that term. Is that a real thing?
The source seems to think so. It describes a phenomenon where people, sometimes on purpose, sometimes not, tap into other people's life force.
Okay.
And it leaves those people feeling drained and empty. The Hawaiian word for this life force is mana.
Mana. Yeah.
And the source says, everyone has it to some degree.
So you're saying there are people out there sucking our mana. How would we even know if that's happening?
That's a really good question. And the source actually does give some clues about how to tell if that's happening and how to protect yourself. But before we get into those tips, I think it's important to understand what the source says about kahunas and their role in all of this.
Ah, the kahunas. I was wondering when they'd come up.
They're really important for understanding this whole hidden world of energies and entities.
Okay.
The source says that kahunas are masters of their own minds and feelings.
Right.
And they've learned to use the power of love to stop negative forces, even the influence of these shadow beings.
So are kahunas like spiritual warriors fighting these invisible forces for us? Do they have special powers?
It's not exactly like a superhero movie.
Okay.
The source describes it more as having a deep understanding of this energy and being able to use it skillfully. They give this example of a kahuna helping someone who's super stressed and anxious.
Okay.
And the kahuna could actually sense an entity that was attached to this person and was causing them harm.
Wow. So did the kahuna exorcise it? Get rid of this entity?
Not exactly. The source says kahunas don't always fight these entities directly.
Oh.
They know ways to help people separate from them, to get their energy back in balance. It's all about empowering the person to control their own energy.
So it's not like we're just victims in this, like, energy battle.
Right.
We can actually do something about it.
Absolutely. And the source even gives us this really interesting technique called the mirror technique.
Okay.
And it's supposed to help us understand the real nature of problems and dilemmas. And it all starts with, well, holding up a mirror. Figuratively, of course.
A mirror, how does that work?
It's not literally looking in a mirror, but using this idea of reflection to understand the situation.
Okay.
So instead of, going directly at someone about a problem, you hold up this imaginary mirror to the problem itself and try to understand what it wants, what it's about.
So I should, like, treat the problem itself as if it's alive. Like it's got its own goal.
That's one way to think of it, yeah. The source says the mirror technique isn't about placing blame, but really trying to understand what's going on beneath the surface.
I see. Okay. This is already really interesting. But I want to know, how does this mirror technique work? Like, practically. Could you give me an example?
Sure. Let's say you keep self-sabotaging. Like every time you almost reach a goal, something happens and you get derailed.
Oh, yeah. I think we've all been there. Super frustrating.
Instead of blaming yourself or bad luck or whatever, the mirror technique says, ask the pattern. What's your intention? What are you trying to show me?
Okay. I can see how looking at it that way could help. But how do I get an answer from this pattern?
That's where it gets a bit more introspective. The source says that when you engage with the problem this way, you can start to untangle it. Figure out where it came from, what motivates it, and how much power it has over you.
So it's kind of like I'm giving the problem a voice, and I'm asking it, what do you want? Why are you doing this?
It's not an actual conversation, no, but more of an exploration you do internally. And the source suggests that this can give you insights into your own subconscious patterns and motivations.
This sounds a little like therapy now.
Yeah, there are definitely some similarities there. Both therapy and the mirror technique encourage you to look inward and understand the root causes of your struggles.
So it's not about, ignoring our negative thoughts and feelings, but about understanding them and learning from them.
Exactly. The source says that real freedom comes not from pretending these difficult parts of ourselves don't exist, but from accepting them, turning them into something we can learn and grow from.
This whole idea of seeing our challenges in a different light, it's pretty fascinating. It's making me think that maybe this human condition we've been talking about, maybe it's more flexible than we think.
That's a great observation. And it leads us to a really big question that the source keeps coming back to. What does it actually mean to be human?
Right.
And can we go beyond the limits that keep us tied to this reality?
Wow. Yeah, that is a huge question. And I'm definitely ready to dive deeper into it. So where do we go from here? What other things does the source say about the nature of this human condition, and if we can actually break free from it?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Let's explore how this idea of the human condition connects to the idea of escaping this dimension and experiencing other realities.
So we've talked about this human condition being like a framework, limiting how we see reality. And then there's these mysterious shadow beings and the idea of psychic vampirism. But how does it all connect? Is the source saying there's a way to break out of this framework and experience something more than our everyday reality?
That's what it seems to be saying. And what's really interesting is how the source describes this human condition almost like a cage, but not one that someone else puts us in. It's more like we build it ourselves, piece by piece with all our beliefs or fears or attachments.
So we're trapped by how we see reality. That's kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah.
But if that's true, how do we get out? Does the source tell us how to take apart this cage we've made?
Well, the source points to the kahunas.
Right.
It says they're examples of people who have, at least to some extent, gone beyond the limits of the human condition. They've done the work, mastered their minds and emotions, and learned to act from love, not fear.
That makes sense, yeah.
Yep.
We talked before about how kahunas can perceive and interact with those unseen energies and entities. But how do they actually do that? What's the secret? Can anyone learn it?
The source doesn't give us a simple answer or a step-by-step guide. It just really emphasizes doing the inner work, facing our own, darkness, and learning how to deal with that world of energy and entities with wisdom and compassion.
So it's not about just avoiding negative energy. It's about understanding it, even using it for good. Is that what the kahunas have figured out?
Exactly. Remember that neutral energy we talked about? The kahunas are presented as having mastered the ability to tap into that energy and direct it, not for themselves, but to help others.
This reminds me of like light workers or energy healers that you hear about in New Age stuff. Are those ideas connected to what the source is talking about?
Yeah, there are definitely some similarities there. But what's interesting about this source is that it ties these ideas to a specific tradition, Hawaiian spirituality, and it presents them in a very practical way. It's not like some mystical belief system, but more like, here are practices and techniques that people have used for generations.
Like it's saying, yeah, this is real, but it's not magic. It's a skill you can learn.
Exactly, and one of the key tools they use is the mirror technique. Remember, it's not just thinking about your own feelings, it's about actually holding up that mirror to the problem itself.
Okay, I'm still not totally clear on how that works.
Yeah.
Can you give an example of how someone would use the mirror technique for a real problem?
Sure. Let's say you're struggling with procrastination.
Oh, yeah?
Got a big project due, but you just can't get started.
Relatable.
Right. Keep finding things to distract you, putting it off to the last minute.
Been there.
So instead of just getting mad at yourself or forcing yourself to work, the mirror technique says sit with that feeling of procrastination like it's a person.
So I'm having a conversation with my procrastination. What would I even say?
You might ask it, what are you scared of? What are you trying to protect me from? What do you need?
Okay, that is interesting. It's like I'm trying to figure out why I'm procrastinating, not just that it's a bad habit I need to break.
Exactly. By doing that, you might discover that your procrastination is coming from like a fear of failing or not believing in yourself. Or maybe it's protecting you from pressure, living up to what other people expect.
So if I understand the root of the problem, I can deal with it better. It's not just willpower.
That's the key point. The source says real change doesn't come from forcing, it comes from understanding. When you bring those hidden fears and beliefs into the light, you can start to take apart that cage you've built and experience reality in a bigger way.
This is really making me think about how much of what I call reality is just my own perceptions, my beliefs. It's a little scary to think I could be limiting myself without even knowing it.
That's the power of this kind of thinking. It makes us question everything and look deeper. And the source suggests that when we do this work, when we become more aware of these unseen forces and our own power, we can start to create a reality that aligns with what we really want.
There's a call to action, right? To step out of the shadows and into like our full potential.
Right. Perfectly said. And the source reminds us that we're not alone in this. There are guides, teachers, practices that can help us on the way. The kahunas are just one example.
This is all so inspiring, but it's also a little overwhelming, Where do we even start to unravel all this energy, entities, illusion? It's a lot to take in.
That's a great question, and the source actually answers it directly. It points to some practical things we can do to start exploring these concepts, and one of the simplest but most important is cultivating awareness.
Awareness. What do you mean by that?
It means paying attention to what's going on inside us and around us, with curiosity and openness, noticing our thoughts, our feelings, our energy levels, and also being aware of synchronicities and patterns in our lives.
So being more mindful, more present. Noticing the little things that might be guiding us.
Exactly. And when we cultivate this awareness, we can start to tell the difference between what we truly want and what's influencing us from outside, whether that's other people, entities, or even our own limiting beliefs.
This makes me think of that saying, know thyself. It's like we can't really master the outside world until we master what's going on inside us.
That's a great connection. The source really emphasizes that true power doesn't come from controlling things outside of us, but from mastering our own minds and emotions.
Okay.
It's about becoming the ruler of our own inner world.
I love that metaphor. So as we become more aware of our inner world, what's the next step? What other tools does the source recommend for breaking through this illusion?
Well, the source says that once we've developed some self-awareness, we can start exploring specific techniques for interacting with energy and entities. This might include things like meditation, visualization, or working with someone who's skilled in these areas who can guide us safely.
So it's not about jumping into the deep end without knowing how to swim.
Right.
It's about learning gradually with the right support. But some people might be hesitant to try those more esoteric practices. Is there anything we can do in the meantime to protect ourselves from those negative energies and influences?
That's a good point, and the source does address that. It gives some practical tips for shielding ourselves, like setting boundaries, practicing energetic hygiene, and calling on our own inner strengths and, maybe spiritual allies for help.
Setting boundaries and energetic hygiene, those sound like things anyone can do, even if they're not ready to dive into the More mystical stuff.
Exactly. These are practices that can fit into anyone's life, no matter what they believe or their spiritual background.
So it's like we have all these tools for dealing with this unseen world, but we have to learn how to use them. But where do we learn? Does the source give us any specific guidance?
The source encourages us to explore different traditions, practices, to find what feels right for us. It doesn't push any one path, but it really stresses the importance of exploring and discovering what works for you.
That makes sense. It's about finding your own way, your own unique path to breaking through the illusion and becoming your full self. But some listeners might be wondering, what's the point of all this? What do we get by escaping the human condition and reaching those other realities?
That's a great question. And the source does explore it deeply. It suggests that by transcending those limits on how we see things now, we can experience more freedom, creativity, and joy. We can tap into a deeper well of wisdom and compassion, and ultimately contribute to the evolution of consciousness itself.
Wow, that sounds amazing. But is that really possible for everyday people, or is this just a fantasy for, spiritual seekers?
The source says it's possible for everyone, not just a special few. It says we all have the potential to wake up to our true selves and experience a bigger reality. But it's not passive. It takes effort, dedication, and a willingness to step outside of what's comfortable.
So it's not enough to just read about these ideas. We have to try them out, see what works for us?
Exactly. The source says this is a process of learning, experimenting, and refining how we approach things. It's not about being perfect, but about always striving for more awareness, understanding, and mastery. And it's a journey that can be both challenging and super rewarding.
This has been such an amazing deep dive so far. I feel like I'm seeing the world differently now, and I'm definitely curious to learn more about what the source says about, the ultimate goal of this journey, what we can potentially do to help consciousness evolve.
That's where we're headed next. The source offers some really mind-blowing perspectives on how everything is connected, the power of collective consciousness, and the role each of us plays in the grand scheme of things.
This deep dive has been, just packed with things to think about. We've gone from shadow beings to psychic vampirism, from kahunas to the mirror technique. I gotta say, I'm still kind of wrapping my head around it all. But one thing that's really sticking with me is this idea that we could actually transcend the human condition. What does the source material say about what's on the other side of those limitations?
That's where things get really, really interesting. The source suggests that when we unravel this illusion of the human condition, we're not just escaping limits, we're actually tapping into this huge network of interconnected consciousness. It's imagine you've been playing a single-player game your whole life. And then suddenly you realize, oh, it's actually a massively multiplayer online game.
Whoa, okay, so you're saying there's this bigger reality out there, a collective consciousness that we're all part of, but we're not aware of it because of those limitations for the human condition.
Exactly. And the source goes even further. It says this collective consciousness isn't fixed, it's evolving. And we're all playing a part in that evolution, whether we know it or not.
That's a huge idea.
Yeah.
But it also raises some questions for me. If we're all connected like that, why don't we experience it? And what does it even mean to contribute to the evolution of consciousness?
Well, the source suggests that the human condition is like a filter. It narrows how we see things and stops us from being aware of this interconnected reality. It's like wearing blinders, You can only see straight ahead. As for contributing to the evolution of consciousness, it's not about reaching some big spiritual goal or becoming enlightened overnight. It's about the choices we make in each moment that align with love, compassion, and understanding.
So it's about the little things, the everyday stuff. It's not about being a guru or a superhero. It's about living with love and compassion in our regular lives.
Exactly. The source emphasizes that even small acts of kindness and awareness can have this ripple effect. They can influence the collective consciousness in ways we might not even grasp. Think of it like dropping a pebble in a pond and watching the ripples spread out.
That's a really cool visual. Makes me think about what kind of impact we could have if we all started making more conscious choices. If we all focused on love and compassion instead of fear and separation.
And that's exactly what the source is inviting us to do. To recognize that we're all connected and to choose actions that support the well-being of everyone. It's about shifting from me to we.
This has been such an amazing deep dive, so many mind-blowing ideas and inspiring possibilities. As we wrap up here, what's the one thing you hope our listeners will take away from this whole exploration?
If I had to boil it all down to one point, it'd be this. You are not separate. You are part of something way bigger than yourself, this vast interconnected web of consciousness that's always evolving. And your choices, your actions, your very being, they all matter.
That's a beautiful message and so empowering. Thank you for taking us through this complex and fascinating material. I think our listeners are going to be thinking about these ideas for a long time.
My pleasure. And remember, this is really just the beginning. There's so much more to discover, both inside ourselves and out in the world. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep expanding your awareness. You never know what incredible realities you might find.
That's the perfect way to end it. To our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another exploration into the hidden depths of knowledge and experience. Until then, stay curious,